2 minutes. That was all she had left. Nobody in that whole building would listen to her, not one of them. But Nora knew something they didn't, and the clock was almost out of time. She couldn't speak. She could barely lift her hand, but she kept tapping that little band on her wrist over and over, because the name printed on it, it wasn't hers. "You're just a volunteer," that's what they told her, right before they pulled the vest off her shoulders, in front of everyone. But taking her badge didn't take away what she'd seen. He knew. The whole time, he knew exactly what he'd done. And every second he stayed quiet, that clock kept ticking. The question was simple. Would he speak up before it was too late? He'd worked those halls 30 years. He knew where they kept the papers nobody was meant to see. One quick look, one key pressed into her hand, and just like that, he gave her a way in. 13:59, 1 minute left. They stepped through that door together, and every head in the room turned. This was it. Everything came down to the next 60 seconds. The clock was running out, and Nora had maybe minutes to stop something that never should have been allowed to happen. Funny thing is, that morning she was nobody. Just a college kid in a volunteer vest, pointing people toward the right desk. She had no idea that by the afternoon she'd be running down this hallway, a whole hospital telling her to back off. One frightened old woman counting on her, and no time left on the clock. It all came down to this: a little plastic wristband. See, it took Nora a while to figure it out, but eventually she did. The name printed on that band wasn't the right one. The woman lying in that bed was not who the paperwork said she was. 2 patients, 1 mix-up, and a procedure scheduled for the wrong person entirely. Nobody else caught it. Nobody else even looked. Just a volunteer and an old woman who couldn't say a word. But let's go back to the start. 9 in the morning. Nora had been volunteering here a couple of months. Nothing dramatic, mostly just pointing people the right way, fetching a wheelchair here and there. She liked it, though. Liked being useful. Liked the little thank yous from folks having a rough day. That morning felt like any other. Coffee, a clipboard, a smile for every worried face. She had no clue what was coming. Around 10, they asked her to take a patient back to her room. Sweet old lady. Couldn't really speak, some kind of stroke a while back, they said. But her eyes, sharp as anything. She held on to Nora's hand the whole way down the hall, patting it, smiling up at her. And Nora had a real soft spot for the older patients. Reminded her of her own grandmother. So she took her time. No rushing. By the time they reached the room, that old woman had decided something. She trusted Nora. You could see it. So when Nora tucked her in and turned to leave, the woman tried to call out. Tried to tell her something was wrong. But the words just wouldn't come. All she could do was lift a shaking hand toward the door, watching this kind girl walk away, not knowing she was the only one who might have listened. And the door clicked shut. Nora made it halfway down the hall before it hit her. That look in the old woman's eyes. It wasn't nothing. So she went back. And this time, she really paid attention. She lifted the wristband, read the name, then looked at the chart hanging off the bed. Read that one too. And her stomach just dropped. Because they weren't the same name, not even close. 2 different people, in one bed. So she did the right thing. Found a nurse, explained the whole thing. The 2 names, the mix-up, all of it. And he was kind about it, he really was. But he was also slammed. 6 patients, no break, running on fumes. Probably just a paperwork thing, he said. I'll flag it. And then his pager went off, and he was gone. Nora stood there. Something in her gut said, probably, wasn't going to cut it. When the nurse didn't call back, Nora went up the chain. The administrator's office. Now this woman was all business. Cool, polished, not a hair out of place. She pulled up the record, glanced at it for about 2 seconds, and said everything matched just fine. The system doesn't make mistakes, dear. That word, dear, like Nora was a child. You're a volunteer. Leave the medical decisions to the professionals. And that was that. Meeting over. On her way out, she passed the break room. And there was this young guy, an intern, Theo. She'd seen him around, always kind of twitchy. But right now, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. The second their eyes met, he froze, nearly spilled his coffee. Couldn't hold her gaze for even a second. Nora hadn't said a word to him, not one, and he was already looking guilty. Now that was interesting. And then she saw the schedule. Right there on the board by the nurse's station. That patient, the one with the wrong name, had a procedure booked. 2 o'clock that afternoon. Nora checked the clock. It was already past noon. Less than 2 hours. Her heart started pounding. Because if that wristband was wrong, and she was sure now that it was, then in less than 2 hours, they'd do the wrong thing to the wrong person. And nobody would even know. Okay. So think about it from her side for a second. She's 20 years old, a volunteer. No badge that means anything, no authority, nothing. And she's just figured out that in less than 2 hours, a hospital is about to do something to the wrong patient. Something that can't be taken back. What would you do? Nora did the only thing she could think of. She started grabbing anyone who'd stand still for 5 seconds. A nurse rushing past. Excuse me, I really need... Gone. A doctor with a clipboard. Sir, please, it's about a patient. Didn't even slow down. See? That's the thing nobody tells you about places like this. Everybody's busy. Everybody's got 12 things going at once. And a worried kid in a volunteer vest? Your background noise. Easy to tune out. She tried the nurse from before, the kind one. But he was already behind a closed door, 3 patients deep. She tried the front desk. Have you spoken to administration? Yes, she had. That went great. And the whole time, that clock on the wall kept moving. 12:15, 12:20. Every minute she spent being ignored was a minute closer to 2 o'clock. And she could feel it slipping away from her. And then the administrator found her. Remember the cool, polished woman from the office? Yeah. She'd heard that Nora was still going around, still asking questions, still stirring things up. And she was not happy about it. She caught her right there in the hallway, in front of everyone. And she wasn't dearing her anymore. I told you to drop this, she said. Quiet, but sharp. The kind of quiet that's scarier than yelling. You are a volunteer. You are here on a school placement. Do you understand how quickly that can end? And there it was. A threat. Plain and simple. Keep pushing, and you're done here. Now here's what's interesting. If Nora was wrong, if this really was just a filing mix-up, why would anyone care this much? Why threaten a kid over a clerical error? That's the part that stuck with her. This woman wasn't annoyed. She was worried. And people don't get worried over nothing. So even as her hands were shaking, even as she nodded and said, Okay, okay, a little voice in the back of Nora's head was going, she's scared. She's actually scared. Which means I'm right. Which means I can't stop now. Nora almost walked away. I mean it. She was scared. She was tired. She'd been shut down by every single person with any power in that building. And part of her was thinking, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just a kid who got something wrong. Maybe I should mind my own business. And then she stopped by that room, one more time, just to check on her. And the old woman was awake, waiting, like she knew Nora would come back. She looked up at her with those sharp, hopeful eyes, and she reached out her hand. Didn't say a word. Couldn't. But she didn't have to. That look said everything. It said, "You're the only one. You're the only one who sees me. Please don't leave." She went looking for the intern, Theo, the twitchy one who couldn't look at her. And she found him tucked away in a corner of the hallway, like he was hiding. She didn't accuse him, didn't yell. She just walked up, real calm, and said, "You know something's wrong, don't you?" And the poor guy just crumbled. You could see it happen. All that nervous energy, all that guilt he'd been carrying around all morning, it just came pouring out. Turns out, he'd been the one who entered the update that morning, the change to the file. He didn't want to. He knew something felt off about it. But he'd been told to, ordered, by someone he couldn't say no to. Someone with the power to end his internship, his whole career, before it even started. So he did it. And he'd been sick about it ever since. "I didn't know it was for a procedure," he kept saying. "I swear I didn't know." His hands were shaking. This kid wasn't a villain. He was just scared. Scared and in over his head, exactly like Nora. But here's the difference. Now that someone had finally asked him straight, now that someone actually wanted the truth, he wanted to tell it. He was just terrified of what it would cost him. So now Nora had something. She had Theo. She had someone who knew the truth and was willing, maybe, to say it out loud. But willing and able are two different things. Because who was he going to tell? The administrator? She's the one who ordered the change. The nurses? They're too busy, and they answer to the administrator anyway. See, that's the trap Nora kept running into all day. The one person she needed to convince was the one person protecting the mistake. She ducked into a stairwell to think, just to breathe for a second, because she knew whatever she did next, it had to actually work. She was out of second chances. If she made one more scene and got thrown out, that was it. Game over. The procedure happens, and that old woman pays the price. She looked at the time. Almost 1 o'clock. About an hour left. And slowly, standing there in that empty stairwell, a plan started to come together. It was risky. It might get her kicked out for good. But it was the only shot she had. She needed proof they couldn't wave away. And she needed someone with real authority to see it, with their own eyes, before 2 o'clock. She took a breath. And she got moving. So they sent her home, right there in front of everyone. And Nora had to do the walk. You know the one. The long, quiet walk down the hallway. Everybody watching, cheeks on fire. Nothing to do but keep your head down and keep moving. Staff had stopped what they were doing. Patients looked up from their chairs. Nobody said a word. Nobody stepped in to help her. And honestly, for a second there, she wanted the floor to just swallow her whole. Part of her wanted to spin around and scream at all of them, make them listen. But she knew exactly how that would look. The hysterical volunteer, causing a scene, proving every single thing they'd said about her. So she didn't. She swallowed it. The anger, the shame, the sheer unfairness of being right and treated like she was crazy. She kept walking toward those exit doors like a good girl who'd finally learned her lesson. That's what they wanted to see. That's what she let them see. Because here's what none of them knew. Nora had absolutely no intention of going home. She just needed them to stop watching. She needed the whole floor to relax and forget about her. And then she'd find another way. She made it all the way to the front doors. The exit was right there. Sunlight, the parking lot, the bus home. All she had to do was walk through. And this whole nightmare would be somebody else's problem. Nobody would blame her. She'd done more than anyone. She'd tried harder than anyone. She could go home with a clear conscience, right? Wrong. And she knew it, standing there with her hand almost on the door. Because a clear conscience isn't about what you can defend to other people. It's about what you have to live with. And Nora knew, deep down, that if she walked out those doors and something happened to that old woman, she would carry it for the rest of her life, every single day. So she stopped, right at the threshold, and she turned around and looked back down that long corridor she'd just been marched down. The clock on the wall said almost 1. Just over an hour left. Everyone thought she was gone. Everyone had moved on. Which meant, for the first time all day, nobody was watching her. And that was exactly what she needed. She wasn't walking out. She was going back in. She just had to be smart about it now. But she didn't get 2 steps before someone said her name. And her heart just sank because she thought, that's it, security, come to throw me out for good. And it was security. An older guard, gray hair, kind eyes, the kind of man who'd worked in that building so long he knew every hallway and every face and probably every secret too. He'd seen the whole thing upstairs, the way they'd sent her off. And he'd seen a lot of things in 30 years on that job. He didn't tell her to leave. Instead, he leaned against the wall next to her, quiet for a second. And then he said, in 30 years, I've watched a lot of important people swear up and down that the system is never wrong. It's wrong plenty. And when it is, it's always the quiet ones who pay for it, the ones who can't speak up for themselves. He looked right at her. You really believe that lady's got the wrong band on her wrist? And Nora said yes, without hesitation. He nodded slow. Because a man who's worked somewhere 30 years isn't scared of some administrator. He's just a good man, tired of watching the wrong people win. All right then, he said. Let's fix it. And just like that, Nora wasn't alone anymore. Now the guard couldn't just walk up and stop a procedure. He didn't have that kind of power any more than Nora did. But what he did have was a way to get her the one thing she was still missing. Proof. Real proof, the kind nobody could wave away. He told her the records room down in the basement still kept the original paper admission forms, the ones patients sign the day they check in, before anything goes into a computer, before anyone can quietly log in and change it. Paper doesn't lie. And if that old woman's wristband matched the original paper form, but not the computer file, then that meant somebody had gone in and changed the record on purpose. That's not a mistake. That's a cover-up. He slipped a key into her hand. Small, worn, ordinary. But it opened the one door that could blow this whole thing open. Third on the left, bottom of the stairs, he told her, low. I never gave you this. Now go, and you move fast. Nora closed her fingers around that key like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because right now, it was. She checked the time. Just past 1. Under an hour left. She didn't waste a second. She ran. The records room was a mountain of paper. Shelves to the ceiling, boxes stacked on boxes, files going back years and years. And Nora had maybe half an hour to find one single form in the whole mess. So she dug, fast as she could, pulling boxes down, flipping through folders, reading name after name after name, dust everywhere, heart pounding, that clock in her head just screaming at her. 1:15, 1:20. Come on, come on. Where are you? More than once she thought it was hopeless, like finding one needle in a whole field of haystacks. But she kept going. Because what was the alternative? And then, in a box near the back, filed under the day the old woman was admitted, there it was. The original form, handwritten, signed, dated the day she checked in. Nora's eyes went straight to the name at the top of the page, and she just froze. One hand flew to her mouth, because the paper matched the wristband. Exactly. Same name, same everything. But the computer that everyone kept telling her was never wrong, said a completely different person, which meant somebody had changed it. Deliberately. This wasn't a typo. It never had been. And now Nora was holding the proof of it, right there in her trembling hands. Now Nora had the proof. But proof doesn't mean anything if you can't get someone to look at it. And the clock was screaming now. Barely half an hour left. She went straight for the one person who'd been even a little bit kind to her. The nurse from that morning. She caught him between rooms, blocked his path, and just held up that paper file. Please, she said. 30 seconds. That's all I'm asking. Just compare this to her wristband. If I'm wrong, I'll leave and never come back. But if I'm right... And something in her voice stopped him. Maybe it was how sure she sounded. Maybe it was the fact that this kid had been thrown out and somehow was still here, still fighting. He'd spent all morning brushing her off. Everyone had. But now, holding that old handwritten form, seeing the name in black and white, he hesitated. Really hesitated for the first time. Where did you get this? He asked. And Nora just said, Does it matter? Look at the name. Then go look at her wrist, please. And for a long second, he just stared at her. And then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said. Show me. They went straight to her room. Nurse in front, Nora right behind him. He was going to check that wristband himself, once and for all, and settle this. But when they pushed open the door, they both just stopped dead. Because the bed was empty, sheets thrown back. The old woman was gone, and Nora's stomach just dropped through the floor. The nurse grabbed the chart off the foot of the bed and flipped it open, and there it was, the old woman's name, right at the top. But the procedure listed under it, that belonged to someone else entirely. Different condition, different treatment, all scheduled under her name because of that switch in the system. He looked at the empty bed. He looked at the clock, and you could see the horror land on his face. They hadn't come too early. They'd come too late. Someone had already taken her down for the procedure. The wrong procedure. Right now. This second. They've got her, he said. They already took her in. And that was the moment everything changed. This wasn't about paperwork anymore, or proving a point, or winning an argument. A helpless old woman was in that room right now. And if they didn't get there in the next few minutes, it would be too late to undo. But a wristband and a piece of paper, on their own, could still be explained away. A mix-up, a coincidence. Who really knows? What they needed was someone to say out loud how it happened. And right on cue, the intern showed up. Theo, the twitchy kid who'd been carrying this around all day, sick with guilt. He'd heard Nora got thrown out, and something about that had finally pushed him over the edge. He couldn't do it anymore. So he walked straight up to the nurse, pale as a sheet, hands shaking, and he said it, out loud. That he'd been told to change the record that morning. That he knew it was wrong when he did it. That he'd been too scared of losing his job to say no. I did it, he said. It was me. But I didn't know it was for a procedure. I swear to God, I didn't know. And you could see what it cost him to say it. His whole career maybe gone in a sentence. But he said it anyway. Because some things are bigger than a job. The nurse looked at Nora. Nora looked at the nurse, and that was it. No more doubt, no more probably. 3 of them now, standing together, holding the truth. And a clock that said 1:40. Here's the thing about that nurse. Once he believed her, he moved. No more hesitating. He knew exactly how these things worked, and he knew there was no time to go up the proper chain of command. No time for meetings, no time for reports, no time to convince the administrator, who, let's be honest, was the last person who'd want to hear it. The procedure was in 20 minutes. Procedure room 3. If they were going to stop it, they had to physically get there and stop it, with their own 2 feet. So he turned and started walking. Fast. Nora right beside him. And with every step, more of it clicked into place for him. The changed record. The administrator shutting Nora down so hard. The threats. It all pointed one direction. Somebody upstairs had made a mistake weeks ago, a big one. And instead of owning it, they'd tried to bury it by rewriting the file. And now that cover-up was about to hurt an innocent woman, not on his watch, not anymore. Stay with me, he told Nora. You started this. You should be there when we finish it. And the 2 of them moved through those halls like the building was on fire. Because in every way that mattered, it was. But somebody was watching. Of course she was. The administrator spotted them from down the hall. The volunteer she'd personally thrown out, now marching through her hospital with one of her own nurses, both of them moving with real purpose toward the procedure rooms. And you could see the exact moment she understood what was happening. Her face went from surprise to something else. Something closer to panic. Because if that nurse had believed the girl, if they were headed where she thought they were headed, then her whole careful little cover-up was about 30 seconds from falling apart. So she went after them. Fast. Calling out, telling them to stop, telling the nurse he had no idea what he was interfering with. But here's the beautiful thing. Nobody stopped. The nurse didn't even turn around. Because now there were 2 of them who knew the truth. Plus an intern ready to confess, plus a piece of paper that proved everything. She couldn't threaten her way out of this one. She couldn't shut down all of them. It was too late for that. The clock said 1:55. 5 minutes. Procedure room 3 was just ahead. And behind them, the woman who'd caused all of this was running. For the first time all day. Scared of a 20-year-old volunteer. They ran. Down the hall, around the corner, straight toward procedure room 3. And halfway there, the administrator stepped out and blocked their path one last time. Arms out, face flushed. Stop. You can't go in there. You have no idea what you're interfering with. And for a second, everybody froze. because that was exactly what she wanted. Delay. Just a little more time, and it would all be over, and she could bury it forever. But the nurse wasn't a scared kid she could talk down to. He held up that paper file right in her face, and his voice was low and steady and absolutely furious. This is the original admission form. It matches the wristband. It does not match the chart. Somebody changed the record. And unless you'd like to explain that to the authorities, you will step aside. Right now. And you could see it. The exact moment her whole world caved in, because she had no answer. No clever thing to say, no threat that would work, no way to make paper lie. She'd spent the entire day treating Nora like she was nothing. A silly girl. Background noise. And now that silly girl was standing there, holding the one piece of evidence that ended everything. The administrator's mouth opened and closed. And for the first time all day, she had absolutely nothing to say. So they didn't wait for her. The nurse stepped around her, Nora right on his heels, and they covered those last few steps to the door together. Because there was only one thing that mattered now, and she was just on the other side of it, with maybe seconds to spare. The door swung open, and both of them just stopped in the doorway. Inside, the staff were still prepping the table, laying out the sheets, getting everything ready. They hadn't started. There was still time. The nurse's voice cut through the room, loud and clear. Stop. Wrong patient. Wrong chart. Nobody touches her until we sort this out. And every head turned. The staff froze, gloves half on, instruments half ready, staring at the two people standing in that doorway, one nurse and one out-of-breath volunteer in a red hoodie. For a second, nobody understood. And then the nurse stepped inside, holding up that paper file, and he laid it all out. The wristband, the original form, the name that didn't match the chart they were about to work from. And the whole room went quiet as it sank in. What they'd almost done, the wrong procedure, on a woman who couldn't even speak up to stop it. Caught with maybe a minute to spare. By a volunteer. A 20-year-old that every single person in that building had brushed off all day long. They found the old woman just outside, waiting her turn. And when she saw Nora walk in, her whole face changed. Because she'd known. All day she'd known something was wrong, and there wasn't a thing she could do about it. She'd been sitting there, helpless, watching it all get closer and closer. And then the one person who'd listened to her came through that door. Nora went straight to her, knelt down, and took her hand, just like she had that morning. And the old woman gripped it tight, and she didn't let go. Both of them shaking. Both of them finally safe. They wheeled her back to her room. Safe. But safe doesn't mean okay. Not right away. Because the poor woman was still shaking, still terrified. Think about what she'd just been through. Hours of lying there, unable to speak, watching strangers get ready to do something to her that she knew was wrong. And no way to tell anyone. No way to scream, no way to run, nothing. Just trapped inside her own body while it all closed in. That kind of fear doesn't just switch off because the danger's past. So Nora didn't try to make her feel better with words. She just pulled a chair up next to that wheelchair, took the old woman's hand in both of hers, and stayed. Held on. Let her shake. Let her be scared. "You're okay now," she said softly. "I've got you. Nobody's touching you. I'm not going anywhere." And slowly, The shaking started to ease. The old woman looked at her, eyes still wet, still frightened, and she squeezed Nora's hand as hard as she could, which wasn't very hard. But it said everything. It said thank you. It said you saw me. It said I was so scared and you came. And Nora just nodded, blinking back her own tears, and held on tighter. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Sometimes saving someone isn't the dramatic part. The running, the proof, the last-second rescue that's over in a flash. Sometimes the part that really matters is what comes after. Sitting with someone in the worst moment of their life and simply refusing to let them go through it alone. And that Nora could do. That she was very good at. There were consequences. There had to be. And here's the part that surprised even Nora. The administrator, the one who'd fought her all day, who'd threatened her and thrown her out. She didn't have any fight left in her by the end. When the board pulled the records and saw it all laid out, the original form, the edited file, the exact time it was changed and by whose login, there was nothing left to hide behind. And to her credit, just barely, she didn't try. She stood there in that hallway, head down, and she admitted it. All of it. She'd caught the mix-up weeks ago. And instead of reporting it, instead of doing the hard, embarrassing right thing, she tried to make it disappear because she was scared of what it would do to her career. That one choice had nearly cost an innocent woman everything. She knew it. You could see it crushing her. She was suspended that afternoon, and she wouldn't be making those kinds of decisions again. Then there was Theo, the intern. He could have stayed quiet, could have let it all land on her and walked away clean. But he didn't. He stood right there and apologized. To Nora, to everyone, took full responsibility for his part in it. And because he came forward when it counted, they gave him another chance, a real one. Because he wasn't a bad kid, just a scared one who found his backbone a little late. And the old security guard? He stood off to the side through all of it, arms folded, that quiet little smile on his face. He caught Nora's eye and gave her a small nod. The kind that says, "You did good, kid." And she really, really had. A few days later, before she was discharged, Nora took the old woman out to the little garden behind the hospital. Just the two of them, in the warm afternoon sun. And what a difference a few days makes. The fear was gone from her face now. That haunted, trapped look, gone. She sat there in her wheelchair with the sun on her cheeks. And when Nora said something silly, she actually laughed. A real laugh. Quiet, but real. She still couldn't say much out loud. Didn't need to. She'd scribble notes on her little pad, and Nora would talk, and the two of them would sit there like old friends who'd known each other for years. Funny how life works. That morning, they'd been strangers. A volunteer and a patient. Two people who should have crossed paths for 5 minutes and never thought of each other again. And instead, they'd saved each other. Because that old woman gave Nora something too. She gave her proof. Proof that one person, even a young one, even one nobody takes seriously, can change the way a whole story ends. Just by refusing to look away. By caring enough to be a pain. By trusting that little voice in your gut that says something isn't right here, even when every important person in the room is telling you to sit down and hush. The nurse spotted them from across the garden on his way to his shift, and he lifted his hand and waved. And the old woman waved right back, grinning. Two people who got to keep the rest of their lives sitting in the sun, All because a 20-year-old in a red hoodie decided one frightened stranger was worth fighting for. And that's the whole thing right there. That's everything.